The scriptures for today's message are from Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "What is written in the law?" Jesus replied. "How do you read it?" He answered, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself." "You have answered correctly," Jesus replied. "Do this and you will live." But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" In reply, Jesus said, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, took him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper. 'Look after him,' he said, 'and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" The expert in the law replied, "The one who had mercy on him." Jesus told him, "Go and do likewise." For this last sermon in the What Would Jesus Say series, I have planned to talk about the Me Too movement. It's an important topic and points to a serious defect in our culture, that people, oftentimes men, use their position of power to take advantage of others for their own pleasure, or create a culture of degrading or demeaning one's gender through jokes and language that devalues them as a human being. I think Jesus would have a lot to say about that today, and he would especially have strong words for those who claim to be Christians who do that sort of thing. But the news of this past week, with protests occurring in city after city around this country, sparked most recently by the death of George Floyd at the hands, or should I say the knee, of a Minneapolis police officer, seems to demand that we address this issue. What would Jesus say about the brokenness and injustice in our world? Many times over the last week, I have thought about that painting of Jesus looking down on the city of Jerusalem, and I imagine him looking down on our cities today in turmoil and having the same sadness. Matthew records his words in the 23rd chapter of his gospel, verse 37. "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who killed the prophets and stoned those sent to you, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were not willing." What would Jesus say about the Black Lives Movement? Many people have responded to the Black Lives Matter movement by saying all lives matter. Of course, that's true, but no matter how sincere and well-meaning they are, this response is often seen as ignoring the problem or playing down its significance. Quiz Falls, who was friends with some of our young people and visited our church when they performed in our youth praise band, is a student at Central Methodist University and has spent his summers doing vacation Bible camps for InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. He's a talented singer. He's also an African American and a friend of mine on Facebook. And last Wednesday, in response to the All Lives Matter comments, Quiz posted on Facebook, "I've seen a lot of this recently, but I feel I need to say, all lives matter is a protest to the protest. If you agree there's a problem, do something about it." My daughter sent me a message she saw on Facebook the other day that makes reference to Jesus' story in Luke chapter 15. It said, 100 sheep, but one goes missing. Jesus leaves the 99 and goes after the one. The 99 think, "But what about us? Don't we matter?" Of course the 99 still matter, but they're not the ones in danger. The one is. I won't pretend to understand what it feels like to be a person of color in our country. I felt a little bit of the anxiety that comes from being a minority on our trip to Japan and China, where not only did I look different, but my faith was so unusual that I was told that the Japanese didn't even have a word for pastor. Yet even there, I was valued and sought after because I possess the American dollar. So I don't really know how it feels to be treated differently because of the color of my skin. But I can tell you, my heart has been breaking this week for our country, for those who cry out for justice, and for those who have suffered loss. I won't recount all the stories and the arguments and the anger that I've seen on the news and social media. You've had enough of that, more than likely. Instead, I will focus on what Jesus would say, in fact, what he actually has said. And I believe that his words speak not only to the Black Lives Matter issue, but also to the Me Too movement that I chose to not talk about today. Too much of the news is depressing and discouraging, but this week I saw a story that brought tears to my eyes and hope to my heart. It was a story on NBC Nightly News about a man being called the Good Samaritan in Washington, D.C. Rahul Dubey lives on Swan Street in a row house on a narrow street in a historic part of Northwest D.C. From his porch the other night, he saw a group of protesters who had been trapped on the narrow street by police forces blocking off both ends of the street. They had been peacefully protesting, he said, but they had violated the new 7 p.m. curfew that had been put into effect that day. As police converged on them from both ends of the street, some knelt down and others chanted, "Let us go through." They said they just wanted to go home. When pepper spray and tear gas was used on them, they panicked. Dubey opened his door and began to shout to them, "Get in the house." NBC reports that over 70 people took refuge in his house that night before the door was closed. Neighbors handed milk over the back fence and snacks to help those who were suffering from tear gas and to get them through the night. The group stayed all night until 6 a.m. when the curfew ended, and then they left with hugs and offers to send him money and expressions of gratitude. As one young white woman said, "You saved my life." Dubey says that the best part was that they got to know each other, people of every age and race, and became friends. He said, "It was America in my living room." He's being called the hero of Swan Street and a Good Samaritan, but he says only, "I saw a need, and I opened a door." I confess that I have struggled with finding the words to respond to the news this past week. But when I think about what Jesus would say, I think the story of the Good Samaritan rings especially true. It emphasizes what Jesus calls the two greatest commandments, love for God and love for others. Like the expert in the law who admitted that the way to life was to love the Lord with all his heart and soul and mind and strength and to love our neighbors as ourselves, like him, we may be guilty of wanting to justify ourselves by asking, "Who is my neighbor?" There are people who propose that when Jesus says we are to love another, he means only to love other Christians. That allows them to hate many of those that they would like to hate. But Jesus' story of the Good Samaritan gives us a totally different view. It was the religious people, the priest and the Levite, who ignored the man who was beaten and left to die by the robbers. And I'm sure that they had many good arguments for why they ignored the man in need. Perhaps they thought he deserved what he got, maybe. Maybe he was part of a trap, and they would be attacked if they stopped to help him. Perhaps he was dead already, and if they came into contact with a dead body, they would have to go through a period of ritual cleansing, which would be inconvenient and cause them to miss important appointments and responsibilities at the temple. A 74-year-old man who lived down the street from Rahul Dubey says that he would never have opened his door to that many strangers. Fear was likely one of the reasons why the priest and the Levite were unwilling to help. The fact that Jesus chose a Samaritan to be the one to demonstrate how to live the way God would have us to live was no doubt a surprise to his audience. Samaritans were considered dogs by the Jewish people of his day, half-breeds who were considered unclean. The normal Jewish person traveling from Jerusalem to Galilee would cross the Jordan River and go around Samaria all the way on the other side rather than dirty themselves by going straight through to Galilee through Samaria. In John chapter 4, the Samaritan woman at the well was shocked that Jesus would even talk to her, not because of her checkered past, but because she was a Samaritan and a woman. What would Jesus say to us today? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus said the merciful Samaritan is what a neighbor looks like. And as you read the stories of Jesus and how he treated the oppressed and the possessed and the distressed of his day, I think you can see that Jesus was a neighbor. And to borrow from Mr. Rogers' expression, I believe he would ask, "Wouldn't you like to be a neighbor too?" Follow me. Do what I do. Furthermore, when I think of what Jesus would say to us about the mess in our country's in, I think he would say the words from Matthew chapter 7, verse 12, "In everything, do to others what you would have them do to you. For this sums up the law and the prophets." Imagine what this world would be like if we would all practice these words. I could give examples, but I'd rather you do the heavy lifting here. Think of some of the things that have happened this past few weeks, the things that haunt you on the nightly news, and ask, how would this be different if we truly followed Jesus and treated others as we would have them treat us? If we loved them and granted them the grace that we are so quick to grant ourselves? You might be thinking, I've heard the story of the Good Samaritan all my life, Randy. I've learned the golden rule since I was in Bible school. When I was in college, I learned that it often takes repeating something 7 times before people will learn it. And I don't even know how many times it takes before we start to live it. But I'm guessing it generally takes many more times to hear it before we do that. So let's live it. When you see a need, open the door. 3 men had a chance to be a neighbor to a man in need that day, a priest, a Levite, and a Samaritan. Which one of these are you? May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace now and forevermore. Amen.